Whereas original versions of IPA tended to balance malt and hops, the last couple decades have seen a shift toward lower malt character with increased hop pungency, one goal being to emphasize the crisp drinkability of this relatively strong style. While this can be accomplished with simplified grain bills, often absent of anything but base malt, many brewers rely on the use of, well, a simple adjunct ingredient to achieve this goal. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and this week I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to chat about the use of simple sugars, namely sucrose and dextrose, in brewing.
Sugar is so hot right now, Marshall. It feels like we've come full circle. It seems like it was a pretty common ingredient in recipes when, you and I first started cutting our teeth. Mainly it's probably just a way to compensate for the fact that you're doing partial mashes and couldn't fit everything in your little pot on your stovetop. But now people are really geeking out on sugars, and dry beer is really hip. And why not make a super crushable beer and use some really cheap sugar to help us get there?
Yeah, when I started brewing, 2002, 2003, I viewed the use of sugar as almost sacrilege. Everybody talked about the fact that the crappiest, kits come with sugar, or if you're using sugar, you're cheating, right? You're not using malt. Well, when that phase passed, as it did for a lot of people, I think, when they were new to brewing, I was then worried that it would contribute certain off flavors. Well, I no longer harbor such concerns, and I have used, just like you, Jordan, sugar, different types of sugar in different styles of beers many times over the years. But does that type of sugar matter? That's exactly what we're going to be digging into today. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for supporting our efforts, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique perks from YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor, among other things. You can learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. And if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of our show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that, as well as it makes us easier to find for those who may not have heard of us yet. I do want to say thanks to the several people who have left reviews after I commented that we haven't been getting as many once we hit that 1,000 review mark. We really do appreciate it. I think I saw 6 or 7 come through over the last couple of weeks, so that's pretty rad. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who I am convinced are doing perhaps more than any other company out there to keep this hobby alive, whether that's through making awesome brewing and beer-related videos for their YouTube channel, continuing to improve on already great brewing gear, or spreading the love by sponsoring outfits like us. We appreciate all of it and completely stand by our promotion of their products. We love everything that Clawhammer Supply has to offer brewers out there, various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes, of course. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup. Both of them are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits, as well as recipe kits. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We are confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. All right, listener and patron Zachary had some feedback after listening to our latest Brews Views episode. And Jordan, I'm really curious what your thoughts are on what Zachary had to say. He says, I wanted to follow up on your point about feeling marginalized in the homebrewing community. I picked up the hobby recently and live in an area with no local homebrew shops or festivals. Because of that isolation, my only interactions with other brewers have been online, like Reddit, or at my local club. Since I happen to fit the stereotypical homebrewer mold, I know my perspective is naturally limited. Because I haven't seen or experienced this side of the hobby firsthand, I'm really curious to learn more. Can you elaborate on this, or maybe share some of the specific experiences from people who feel pushed out? I'd love to broaden my understanding of the subject. Jordan, are you familiar? I mean, have you heard from people who have felt like they just didn't fit into this hobby or anything like that?
Absolutely. I think it's a major problem with the hobby and probably the brewing industry writ large. It's a bunch of middle-aged, white, bearded dudes. And right. I would imagine that there's probably forms of, active and passive racism that exist, also sexism. There's probably going to be different flavors of that, whether it's people that are, explicitly saying and doing bad things, or kind of just like, well, no one there looks like me. Why would I want to hang out with them? And so it kind of creates this like self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's something my club has definitely been really active in trying to, recruit more diverse members. And I'm pretty proud at the increased female presence that we've had lately at meetings. But there's a bit of a birds of a feather flock together effect probably, and that if people that look like you aren't doing the hobby, you're probably not very likely to pick it up in the first place. And so we just need to do everything we can to be inclusive and then actively encourage people that don't look like us to join us in one of the best hobbies on the planet.
Oh, amen, man. I really appreciate feedback like Zachary's, as well as his desire to broaden, his understanding of experiences that just, by virtue of being who he is or who we are, we're not going to experience, I've heard from so many people over the years, mostly online because of Brülosophy, I guess, but, even some locally. I mean, women who feel out of place around guys making insensitive, crass jokes, which only gets worse the more they drink. I think you can probably know what I'm talking about there, Jordan. Queer friends who feel either threatened, completely put off, or both by the bro culture that I guess has become sort of associated with brewing and beer. Non-white people who just feel uncomfortable walking into a club or a pub filled with people who all look exactly like you and me, Jordan. The list goes on and on. I have heard from several people. I'm not calling anybody out. I'm not going to name names. I don't think that's fair. But my hope is that as we push for greater awareness and acceptance, that your generation, Zachary, and by generation, I just mean you're a new brewer, you're new into this. So hopefully you're going to be around as long as Jordan and I have, doing this thing, that when you're at the point where we're at today, 20 years in to the hobby, that things do look different, and that the folks that are doing it with you don't have to deal with the bullshit that some of us have had to deal with. It's just not comfortable. Even as somebody who fits the mold, observing that doesn't make me feel good. I don't agree with it, So anyways, that's the goal. I hope we eventually achieve. Again, I appreciate your question, Zachary. I know that was probably not the longest, most long-winded, I guess, response to it. I think as you're around people in this hobby long enough, you're going to start to hear more and more stories about why it looks so homogenous. And I'm just not, that's not something that I'm proud of when it comes to this hobby, among the many things that I do love about it, of course. So appreciate your question. Appreciate the feedback. If you have show feedback, you could drop us a line at feedback@brülosophy.com, or you can leave a note on social media. All right. Don't forget to grab your Brülosophy merch over at brülosophy.com/shop. We're offering more options than we ever have before, from t-shirts, hoodies, and hats to fanny packs, shorts, coffee mugs, and so much more. Prices are surprisingly reasonable, and international shipping is now available. Again, head to brülosophy.com/shop and click one of the product images on that page, which will redirect you to our Dashery store. You can go straight there at brülosophy.dashery.com. We've also put a link in the description of this episode. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Like I mentioned before, opinions regarding the use of sugar in brewing are all over the place, with some people absolutely hating it while others just love doing it. Of course, using sugar to make beer is nothing new. It's actually been going on for quite some time. Before we get into the details about sucrose and dextrose specifically, let's focus a bit on the history of sugar in beer.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. It turns out they've been using sugar in brewing for quite a bit of a long time, but maybe we can talk a little about the science first. So, as we all know, beer is a function of fermentation, which is when that yeast or bacteria breaks down carbohydrates, sugars and starches into other substances, famously ethanol. And, most of those sugars that we tend to make beer come from malted grains, malted barley, maybe malted wheat. And that gives you something called maltose, which is a disaccharide consisting of two glucose molecules joined together. So maltose is actually considered a simple sugar, which I didn't really realize. I always kind of thought it was kind of complex.
Yeah, I didn't realize that for a while as well. But it is a simple sugar. Disaccharides are notably disaccharides and monosaccharides are the most notable simple sugars. Maltose, though, it's two glucose molecules joined together. And so one of the arguments that I've heard is that that takes a little bit longer for the yeast to actually break down. It's got to go through that complex process of splitting apart those two molecules before it can then metabolize it into, like you said, ethanol and CO2. So, but historically, in the mid 19th century, in the United Kingdom, they had this horrible barley harvest, right? And that whenever I think of beer in England, I can't help but think about the whole taxation thing. Mm-hmm. It's the same with Germany. I mean, taxes were always a motivator for change in beer. And I think that's just so fascinating, the interplay of like economics and this beverage that we all love so much. But they had this terrible barley harvest. So the government comes along and says, hey, if you're we don't have all the barley to make this beer that everybody wants to drink, you can use sugar now, but you have to do it only if you pay taxes based on the equivalent gravity of the beer that you produce using sugar in the place of barley. So that further incentivized brewers to rely more on these simple sugars than just straight barley. And so it was actually quite common, in the mid to late 1800s, which I find is pretty interesting. Well, then you move into the late 19th, early 20th century. So we move into the 1900s here. Belgian brewers also began using these simple sugars, but it wasn't because of taxation or anything like that. They viewed it as a very easy way to boost the strength of beer without contributing much of anything else. Anybody out there who is familiar with Belgian ale, particularly, even styles like double, but especially in my opinion, triple, what we're talking about. It's got that strength, but it's also incredibly crisp and easy to drink, or if it's done right, at least that's how I perceive it. And so that's what the Belgians were doing. It's also interesting, though, that this occurred right around the same time Belgium's beet sugar industry was just blowing up. So they had ample access to this highly fermentable, sucrose, this table sugar, basically, that they were getting from the process of making sugar from beets. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's one thing you'll hear is like, oh, if you're going to make a Belgian beer, you got to use beet sugar, and I gather that American sugar sources might be made from a different source. So it's interesting that there's like different types of simple sugar too. But these days it's not uncommon for modern brewers to use simple sugars for certain styles, and it's often associated with those that you want a higher ABV, or maybe something that you want to dry it out a little bit more, thin it out a little bit more, perhaps like an American light lager even.
Yeah, and also, I mean, one of the big things that you'll hear overall, we're going to get into like what people have claimed, at least the flavor contribution of using simple sugars is. But one of the big things that I hear, especially with like double IPA, Jordan, I think you can probably speak more to this than I can, is that it doesn't have much of a flavor contribution. It really does get in there. We're just going to call it 100% fermentable. So you're adding booze without adding pretty much anything else. And that makes it incredibly convenient, and it's also cheap as hell. I mean, sugar is probably, to this day, despite all these crazy inflation and prices going up, sugar is still relatively cheap for the amount that you would end up using, in a 5-gallon batch of beer. So I think there's a matter of convenience. I do want to say I spent 2 years, half regrettably, living in Nampa, Idaho. And if anybody who's ever been to Boise and drove south and went to Nampa, you've probably smelled that smell, and that smell comes from a sugar beet factory. Idaho is known for their potatoes, but they also grow sugar beets, and Nampa has one, I guess in the state, has like the biggest sugar processing refinery right there, and it is a god-awful smell. I'm telling you right now. But yeah, I think what most people associate with sugar, at least in the U.S., is CNH or like, sugarcane sugar. So maybe we can do an experiment comparing those two at some point, like beet to sugarcane. I doubt there's going to be any difference, but anyways, there are different types of sugars in brewing. When we speak of the fermentable sugars in brewing, we're, like you mentioned earlier, we're usually talking about maltose, which is considered a simple sugar, though it is unique in that yeast have to work a little bit harder to ferment it, right? It has to break down that disaccharide into its separate monosaccharides, which in this case is just glucose. And in order for to consume that maltose, like I said, it must first be actively transported inside the cell, which is a rate limiting factor, meaning it slows down the overall speed of the process. So this is something that brewers are very well aware of, and it's one of the reasons they might opt to throw in some another type of simple sugar as well, is that it doesn't take as long for the yeast to actually ferment it, and it won't halt fermentation. Again, maltose I don't believe is 100% fermentable because the yeast have to work a little bit harder to get it done.
Yeah, and aren't there certain brewer strains as well that are like known as maltose negative yeast that can't even consume those? And so you got to really think about the type of yeast you're using too, as it relates to the types of sugars that you're adding to your brew.
Yeah, and I think what you're referring to they are kind of getting a little more focus right now because of the whole NA movement. And they just don't, they can't insert, my understanding, and I am no microbiologist, I might be just talking out of my ass here, but my understanding is that they use those maltose negative yeasts because they don't transport themselves inside the cell to further that fermentation process. So it's kind of a neat thing. It does everything else except for the fermentation. I'd be curious to taste a beer made with one of those, but I can't imagine it would taste like the beer you and I are making with regular yeast anyways. Another very common, probably the most common type of sugar known to man is sucrose, also known as table sugar, which is a disaccharide. Disaccharide similar to maltose, except it's made up of one glucose and one fructose molecule that is more readily fermentable by yeast than maltose. And again, I don't know exactly why, but in the process of fermenting sucrose, the yeast uses invertase, which is secreted outside of the cell, to rapidly break down the sucrose into its component monosaccharides, again, glucose and fructose, and those are more easily metabolized by brewer's yeast.
Mm-hmm. Another very popular one is dextrose, which we typically call corn sugar, since it's made from cornstarch. And that's a highly refined monosaccharide or glucose that is 100% fermentable. So as that monosaccharide, dextrose doesn't require the extracellular enzymes to break it down. It's already in its simplest form. And it's often used for bottle conditioning, what's one of my favorite choices for bottle conditioning. And you can also use it to boost the strength of the beer, while in theory lightening the body without adding any sort of off flavors or anything.
Yeah, and so let's just look at those two real quick. You've got sucrose, which is this disaccharide. So it's a di just means two, saccharide means sugar. So you've got these two sugar molecules that are bound together, and the yeast needs to do something ostensibly to break that apart so that it can then metabolize the two separate molecules of sugar. In the case of sucrose, that's glucose and fructose. Dextrose is already just glucose. It's just that one single cell. So the yeast, again, doesn't really have to do much work in order to start fermenting that sugar. And I think that is probably, this is just speculation on my part, but I think that's probably where this idea that if you're going to use sugar in brewing, whether that's for bottle conditioning, keg conditioning, or just bumping up your ABV, it's probably best to go with this simplest form of simple sugar, dextrose, which also happens to ferment insanely cleanly. It is fully 100% fermentable, dries out very quickly. And so I sort of understand why brewers of yore might have been like, let's go with dextrose. We probably shouldn't be using the table sugar that, grandma's putting in her coffee, but I don't know. Have you heard of any other reasons why brewers opted for dextrose over any other form of sugar?
I think the big one was that the rumor was that if you use table sugar, your beer would taste cidery.
Do we want to talk about where that rumor potentially started?
I have no clue. Do you know?
The only place I ever heard that was on very popular podcasts in the early to mid 2000s or 2010s. There's so many things that I've heard other people say. I've talked about DMS a million times where, brewers say that DMS tastes like canned corn or creamed corn. I've never tasted that, even when I'm, sampling flavor spiked beers with DMS. I don't get corn at all. I have a feeling that maybe one person got a cidery flavor out of a beer that happened to be made with sugar and then just associated the two and started talking about it publicly, and everybody latched onto it, as we do. I've never gotten cider out of a beer that I've made with sucrose, and I've gone pretty high percentages of sucrose. I have a friend who makes hop water. I'm sorry, not hop water. He makes hard seltzers, hopped hard seltzers actually. And he uses store-bought beet sugar to ferment. So it's 100% of the fermentables are coming from store-bought table sugar, and they don't taste like cider. So, but I hear what you're saying. For whatever reason, there was this idea going around for many years that if you use table sugar in your beer, that it's going to taste like cider. It's going to have an off flavor. And perhaps later on in the episode, we'll get into some other people's speculation as to what that may have come from as well. But
Well, maybe before we talk about the style of today's episode, let's talk about just a couple other commonly used fermentable brewing sugars. We've got invert sugar. That's a sweet liquid that's made from sucrose that has been split into its component monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. We've got honey, which is mostly glucose and fructose with some other sugars as well. Then you got some various other forms of raw cane sugar like turbinado that might contribute a mild molasses flavor. Heck, I guess you could add molasses. You could add maple syrup. There's a whole thing of Belgian candy sugars. So there's a ton of fun sugars out there to mess around with that may or may not be more appropriate for a given style.
Well, yeah, assuming that they have unique impacts, on their own. I mean, that's the thing. We did an episode, in the middle of last year, I think, similar to this one, but where we were talking about or comparing invert sugar to sucrose, I believe. Invert sugar is sucrose just broken down. So the idea being, again, that if we do the work for the yeast, so the yeast doesn't have to, the yeast will actually perform better. I don't think it matters that much, at least based on those results from that experiment that we talked about back in that episode. It's interesting what we have kind of come to in our minds as being meaningful, and then you actually put it to real world test, and it doesn't seem to be as meaningful as we thought. Anyways, there are so many sugars out there, and I highly recommend people play around with them. One of the things that you'll hear from folks who have used, let's say, maple syrup. My brother brewed beers. He lives out in Buffalo, New York. There's a big maple syrup thing going on out there. And so he made several beers with maple syrup, and I never tasted the maple in it. Like I didn't even get maple flavor. He made this delicious brown ale one time where there was maple syrup, in the wort before he pitched the yeast, and then he also bottle conditioned with maple syrup, and it did not taste like maple to me. I mean, I think you have to use so much of these sugars to get the flavor of the sugar outside of the fermentability that it may be untenable to actually do that. I don't know. Have you had experience like actually getting the flavor of the type of sugar you're using besides honey? I feel like honey actually does do something.
Yeah, I don't even know if I've ever tried to use maple syrup or honey or any of these ones that have some sort of non-sugar flavor. Molasses, have you ever tried that?
I've never used molasses in beer, but that is a very strongly flavored sugar product. So I would imagine, what is it called that they use in England? It's like Triticale
or Scotland maybe.
Or Scotland, over there in the UK, and that has got a very strong flavor. I know, or I've heard from several people who use that, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it definitely adds something to it." Other types of sugars, the reason I bring that up is because we're going to be breaking down dextrose and sucrose, and if you just lick your finger, put it in a bag of dextrose, to me it doesn't even have that sweet thing that table sugar does. But it ferments the same, and I'm looking at that going, well, maybe there's going to be a flavor difference because they taste so different on their own. At least to me, they do. Have you ever tasted dextrose?
Now that you mention it, I don't know that I really have. And I got a jar right next to me, so we'll have to do a tasting episode for Patreon or something.
You start just getting it hooked on it. I know somebody who uses dextrose in place of sucrose, like in their coffee and stuff like that, because he was telling me that it has some like health benefits, or it's like not as bad on some level for like your like if you're diabetic or pre-diabetic or whatever. So I don't know. But in beer, it does seem to do, at least from the fermentation perspective, it does seem to do the same thing as sucrose. So now, the experiment that you performed was on a West Coast IPA. We love West Coast IPA. This is a style where the foundation was laid, back in the 1970s and early 80s, pretty much around the time Sierra Nevada was starting up. And they made that highly hopped, for the time at least, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which I still love to this day. And once that was out there, of course, people started going, well, let's push the boundaries. Let's push it even more. This West Coast IPA in the 90s and the 2000s, you had a few notable breweries like Russian River starting to use less character malts, particularly crystal malt. I'll let you speak to that, Jordan, in favor of further focusing on the hop character. So the idea, the way I like to think of it is that the malt just became the background canvas on which you painted with your hops, right? And even the yeast. I mean, you hear people talk about the Chico strain, again, from Sierra Nevada, as just being super neutral, gets in there, does its job, gets out of the way. You don't really taste the yeast character. It's all about the hops.
Right. And so, in the 2000s and even 2010s, brewers were commonly using a little bit of crystal malt in there for some color. And also they were fairly bitter beers. The IBU wars, we all have our battle scars from that, where people are like 100 IBUs, 1,000 IBUs.
I did 190, Jordan. I made one that was 190. It was god awful, but I did it.
I saw on Instagram the other day that, Mike at Sapwood Cellars has made a IBU war beer for to celebrate their anniversary or something. And he took a sip on the video, but he didn't tell us too much about how the experience was as a modern drinker drinking an old school IPA. But it's just, we've come a long way, right? And so back then, you had more body, more bitterness. And so alongside that, people were like, well, maybe there's other ways we could go about this. So in the 2010s, you start to see some kind of regional variations, like the Midwest IPA, which really doubled down on the malt, the Northeast IPA, aka hazy IPA, which was, obviously notably hazy, often through the use of adjuncts, and then kind of flipping IPA in its head in terms of, almost taking all the bitterness out from the beginning of the boil, flipping that chloride to sulfate ratio on its head and making it super soft with more chloride over gypsum, and that quote pillowy mouthfeel. And then, whereas up here in the Northwest where I live and you used to live, the IPAs might be a little bit more piney and, on the bitter end of things. And then West Coast IPA, which to me really was something that kind of spun out of the San Diego scene, is kind of in my opinion, the best balance of all of these things, because you have the intense hop aromatics that lean into the fruitier realm, be them berry or citrus fruits or something like that. That's a really a firm bitterness, but it's balanced. It's not just crazy IBUs, or at least not anymore. Just way less malt character, and just a beautifully almost lager-like crushability, but with the intense hop experience of the IPAs that we've come to love.
Exactly. I remember when I was living up in Seattle, I had just turned 21 and I was super stoked on craft beer. And of course up there, Red Hook was all the rage at that time. And they had, I don't know when they released it, but I had picked up a 12 pack of Longhammer IPA. Have you had Longhammer?
Gosh, I mean, if it was Red Hook, I probably would have back in the day, but I mean, I don't even remember that brand name anymore.
Yeah, I think it's called Longhammer. I think they still make it, actually. And man, did that define the Pacific Northwest IPA to me. It was so bitter, and it was so piney and resinous and good. I loved that so much back in the day. Like I was telling you, the very first all grain batch of beer that I ever made was an old, what I would now call like a Northwest IPA. That was 190 IBU that I designed back before I was all grain and never brewed. And so when I moved to all grain, I'm like, I finally time to try this out. I've heard people refer to these as enamel peelers. It was that and then some. It was so freaking bitter. This idea that like there's a point of diminishing returns with bitterness, I don't think so. This beer did not seem to substantiate that claim. Anyways, West Coast IPA, like you said, really does a great job of melding that fruitiness, the pininess, that dankness. You can get all of those characteristics, but it's still bitter. It's still clear. It's still crisp and drinkable. It's not pillowy. It has that nice sharpness when you drink it. That's what I've come to love in my IPA. And that, that's kind of, if I'm reaching for an IPA, that's usually what I'm looking for. Interestingly, you had mentioned earlier that American IPA has, you've got all these other sub styles now under that. So I feel like the BJCP description of American IPA is more general. It's more broad. It doesn't really fit what we're referring to as West Coast IPA. So the description that I kind of pieced together based on some stuff I've, come up with or I found online is a highly attenuated, aggressively hoppy, decidedly bitter, and notably clear American ale. It showcases a modern hop profile with a crisp, dry finish and a clean malt character that allows vibrant citrus, pine, and resinous hop character to dominate the palate. How does that sound for a definition?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I think that the main things here when you think about a modern West Coast IPA recipe is you want to think about your hops and your malt and your fermentation. And so with the malt, basically 100% Pilsner malt is all we're using at this point, maybe sugar to help dry it out. And so you want that super clean fermentation. People are really loving using 3470 or Global to get there, fermenting that warm, or you can use the classic Chico strain. And then the hops, we're looking at the most modern, citrusy, sexy hops you can find, either out of Yakima, Oregon, or famously Down Under. And so we're looking at Australian varieties, New Zealand varieties, and leaning into that citrus and gooseberry and other, kind of berry flavors and aromas. We're not going hard on the Chinook and the Columbus in these beers. One trick is that people will use just a little bit on the back end, like 5% or something like that, to kind of round it out. But it should not be a solely C-hop beer.
Yeah. You can make them and they're delicious, but West Coast IPA is going to be more fruity than piney is what it sounds like you're saying basically. Yeah. So in terms of using sugar in this style, you're a perfect example, Jordan. Like you said, a lot of people are using lager yeast for fermenting this style now because it's just even more clean and imparts that nice crisp character. A lot of people are also sticking to just 100% Pilsner malt when making West Coast IPA, but even in doing that, the malt character can still be kind of noticeable, particularly in stronger versions. Once you start to get north of about 7%, it takes, a good amount more malt to get there, and that malt is going to contribute malt character. So, you reach for some simple sugar in place of that Pilsner malt, and it's going to allow a brewer to achieve that desired strength while ensuring minimal flavor impact and keeping the body light enough to stay refreshing. Again, sucrose, dextrose, probably the two most popular simple sugars that brewers are using these days. Sucrose has this reputation of imparting this cidery flavor. So, I don't know I've never polled, commercial brewers out there when it comes to what type of sugar they're using, but I have to imagine that a lot of them are kind of stuck in the same mindset that you got to use dextrose. It's you're not going to get that cidery flavor. You're not going to get those off flavors. Well, I'm a big fan of using simple sugars when making most types of IPA. In fact, I think hazy IPA is the only one that I probably wouldn't use a simple sugar in at this point. While I've used both sucrose and dextrose several times, I've never compared them myself. Do they impart their own unique characteristics? Well, you performed an experiment to see for yourself, Jordan. We're going to get to those results when we're back from this break. Stop guessing and start perfecting your craft with Brewfather, the ultimate tool for recipe design. Brewfather Premium unlocks advanced inventory tracking, tilt integration for real-time fermentation monitoring, and seamless cloud sync across all of your devices. But wait, there's more. Premium Plus just changed the game with Brewfather's brand new AI recipe integration. Whether you're looking to clone a rare commercial classic or need a creative spark for a unique grain bill, Brewfather AI helps you build balanced, world-class recipes in seconds. Brewing is a science. Make it art with Brewfather Premium Plus by visiting brewfather.app today. That's brewfather.app. Better beer is just a click away. Over the last decade, I've become quite comfortable reaching for table sugar when making styles like West Coast IPA, mainly because it's so readily available. I always have it at my house. My daughter loves to bake. She made cookies last night. She used simple sugar. We just have a lot of it on hand. Well, I'd certainly heard claims that it's going to impart this cidery, undesirable off flavor. I've not experienced that personally, though I know many who still prefer dextrose for these purposes.
And I think more importantly, is there a difference in a really hoppy format like a West Coast IPA, right? Because this is a pretty common ingredient in West Coast IPA recipes in that 5 to maybe 10% range. And so that's something that we kind of wonder about is when we're playing with these things on the margins that we've put so much dogma into. in a super flavorful style, can you tell a difference? Because maybe you could in a blonde ale, but who only wants to make blonde ale, right? So I think IPA, it's really time to, bust out the calculator and see if we can taste a difference in a IPA format.
Yeah, so again, we talked in the last segment about kind of modern approaches that brewers are taking to making West Coast IPA. In this case, I'm excited for you to tell us about the grist, and if you wouldn't mind, also just share what your typical, if this is your typical grist, fine, but what you typically, how you approach designing your West Coast IPA recipes, because I've had your West Coast IPA, and it is phenomenal.
Well, thank you, Marshall. So this one was what I was at the time a couple years ago was a really common recipe for me, and I still think this is a good approach, but I've kind of simplified it. So back then I was doing about 75% Pilsner malt. I tend to use German Pilsner malt because I like to make my lagers with German Pilsner malt, and so that's kind of fun that it doesn't taste particularly German when you're throwing these kind of hops at it, but definitely can use American varieties or Canadian varieties as well. And then we're using 19% wheat malt. Also, I'm using German varieties because those are the types I like to use for Hefeweizen. So that's just what I keep on hand because it goes both ways. And then 6% Sucrose or Dextrose in this experiment. And so that was really the big thing is when using a standard amount of sugar in a West Coast IPA recipe in that 5 to 10% realm, because if you go too much further, you might start to get a beer that tastes a little weird if you're using like 20% sugar in IPA format, like we might in a Trappist beer or something like that. And so, yeah, that's why we want to look at a normal usage rate. But 6%, that's not nothing by any means. And we would expect to see a pretty big gravity difference as a function of using that much sugar versus none. But before we get into the brewing process, I'll just say that these days I've kind of dropped the wheat malt. We actually did do an experiment on wheat malt, and I can't remember if we've had a podcast on that one yet or not. But it can be a little harder to clear with gelatin or biofine. You have to get your dosage right with wheat malt. And so we really kind of struggled to taste the difference, I think, with the wheat malt. And so it's just like, if I have it on hand, I might use it, I might not. It just, so it's just, I'm all about making recipes simple. And so these days I'm pretty much like 95% Pilsner malt, 5% sugar or so. But yeah, wheat malt is definitely something you can use. And if you get your findings right, you can still make a clear beer with it.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, these days when you're making a West Coast IPA, are you going with Sucrose or Dextrose? But let's save that for the end of the episode because I want to get to these results first. A 5-gallon batch, you'll often hear people say, just throw in a pound of sugar in place of maybe, half pound to a pound of malt. And that's what you did. I mean, 6% ended up being exactly 1 pound of both Sucrose and Dextrose or Dextrose, in their separate batches, whatever. So, totally fair. Wheat malt, like you said, I don't use it in my West Coast IPA. I don't notice anything from it either. So all makes sense to me.
Yeah, so you want to mash this pretty cool because we're trying to drive attenuation here. So these were single infusion mashes at 147F or 64C for 1 hour. Once that mash is complete, we remove the grains and we add the sugars as the worts were heating up. That's the nice thing about the claw hammer system with their whirlpool arm is you can actually turn that on during this sugar addition process and it stirs it for you, ensures you don't get any scorching or anything like that. And then we boil that for 60 minutes. And so we're adding 14 grams of Warrior for some clean bitterness up top at 60-minute addition. And then at 20, we start to get into our aroma and flavor additions with 14 grams of Nelson. And once that boil was finished, I did a 10-minute hop stand using that recirculation arm. And I did 57 grams of Citra, 57 grams of Nelson, and 28 grams of Strata. What do you think of that?
Yes, please. All day long. That sounds like an awesome blend.
Yeah, this is actually kind of my riff on Society's The Pupil IPA out of San Diego.
So
kind
good.
of a classic modern West Coast IPA. And they, someone reached out to them and got the recipe and published it online. And I think that they use maybe Simcoe in place of Strata in this recipe. And so the Strata is really nice, kind of, pupil-esque approach. And so I really recommend this Nelson Citrus Strata approach. So anyways, after we get those chilled, we get them transferred to their fermenters. And this is interesting. The gravities were identical. Both were at 1056.
I did not expect that. I would have expected I think the table sugar, I would have expected that one to be slightly stronger, to maybe have 2 or 3 more points, but maybe that wouldn't have made a difference either way. But in this case, 1 pound of sucrose versus 1 pound of dextrose in an otherwise identical wort, and you're getting the same exact OG. That to me, right off the bat, regardless of what the organoleptic differences may end up being, is really interesting.
Right, and I struggle to get the same OG when I'm doing the same exact mash and the same ingredients, right, with 2 identical units. So that's pretty amazing it worked out like that. So it seems to suggest that you're going to get similar gravities between these 2 usages. So let's see how they actually ferment out. So we get those fermenters in my fermentation refrigerator chilled down to my desired pitching temperature of 59F or 15C, and I hit each with 20 grams of Citra Incognito. That was actually a dip hop process, so that you have to get that in the fermenter with a little bit of hot wort first, then you finish your chilling and get the rest of your wort in there. And then so once that's all combined, we've got some Imperial Yeast L13 Global, my preferred fermentation vessel or mechanism, as it were, for these types of beers. And after about a week, we're adding some dry hops. I just add them straight into the fermenter at this point. I'm not racking off the yeast cake or anything. I just toss these yeast cakes when I'm done. And so that got 100 grams of Nelson, 71 grams of Citra Lupomax, and another 28 grams of Strata. You okay with that dry hop addition?
That yeehaw. I mean, that is 100 grams. That's almost 4 ounces of just Nelson, which you and I already talked about this. I love Nelson. You add 71 grams of Citra Lupomax, which is another intense product, and some Strata, from Strata, I get kind of a creamy, like almost like a coconut milk flavor from it sometimes. It's interesting. It just adds a little bump to me of like, I always think in terms of audio, but it's like that adds a little bit of that mid-range where it fills the beer out. I really like it. That's a beautiful dry hop schedule to me.
Well, and that's exactly the point, is you're trying to layer these things in here. So we're going heavy on the Nelson to get that tropical gooseberry, New Zealand flavor and aroma. And then Citra, is your base note, right? With 2/3 the usage rate or whatever, but still giving you a ton of that, citrus character in the middle there. And then just a hint of that kind of like dank strawberry funk that Strata brings to round it out at the bottom and to give us a more cohesive and complex kind of profile. So following this dry hop addition for like a day, it's time to take a gravity reading before we get these things transferred off the dry hops and into, fermentation. Lagering and, serving kegs. And both have the same FG again, 1006. So we're sufficiently dry, but man, these things really seem to be doing the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, for all intents and purposes, these beers so far statistically are identical. It's just that one was made with a different sugar than the other one. I would have expected one to have a higher OG and then also for the attenuation to be a little bit different. Though I guess they are both, marketed to use a term that's probably not terribly appropriate, but as being 100% fermentable. So I suppose it doesn't make that, it doesn't surprise me too much, but the fact they started at the same OG and finished at the same FG is at least interesting.
Right. So let's see if people can actually taste the difference. But, first we got to get these things cold and fined and, carbonated. So once we do that, it's time to serve them and take a look at them ourselves, too. So in terms of the objective observations, they looked identical and they were beautiful beers. That pale golden color, sufficiently clear, thanks to some finings with that stark white cap of foam. Looked pretty good to me.
I'm looking at the photo of them right now. They look identical. I wouldn't expect them to look any different anyways. Maybe, I think about, well, if the yeast has to go through this extra work to, break down the disaccharide of sucrose into its separate, then maybe it's going to, produce some sort of a thing that's going to cause more hate. No, they look identical. They look exactly the same to me.
Now that you say that, maybe there is an implication for subsequent yeast health or something, and maybe the subsequent generations or fermentations would act a little differently between the two if you kept fermenting them with subsequently identical recipes, which we didn't test that, so that's an interesting idea. But at least for the beers at hand, they look the same. So we tend to do our own semi-blind triangle tests, and I only got 3 out of 5. The ones that I got right, I kind of thought I might be able to, tease it apart. And I kind of train myself to give myself a leg up and see if I can get these right when I really am familiar with both examples. But maybe it was just bias because I only got 3 out of 5, and they were both great. Exactly what you're looking for in that modern West Coast IPA. Dry as a bone, very hoppy, and extremely drinkable.
Oh, I want one right now, and I'm coming off of a night of drinking, so that'd be just the medicine that I need. So very interesting. You are the brewer. You design these beers. You know exactly what is going on, and even with all of that knowledge, you were only able, or you happened to guess one or the other, the odd beer out just 3 out of 5 times. I mean, you would expect, if we were so good at training ourselves, you would expect more consistency to that, or at least I would. But that is also why we serve these to blind tasters. We don't tell them anything about the variable. Yeah, they might know the beer style. They're obviously looking at them. We do serve them in opaque cups so that if there are visual differences, tasters won't rely on that to tell them apart, because that would be a boring experiment. But in this case, you served the triangle test to 24 blind participants, out of which 13 would have to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with any amount of confidence that it really does seem that these different types of sugars have a unique impact on the flavor of the beer. Out of those 24, again, 13 needed. How many actually got the triangle test right?
We only got 5. That's like almost 20, not even a quarter of participants, right? And so that is definitely not significant. And so tasters just could not reliably tell these beers apart. So it really does seem to suggest that in a super hoppy West Coast IPA with a standard usage rate of like 5% or so of sugar, dextrose and sucrose tend to yield similar beers.
So here's the deal. I have used sucrose to date probably more than I have dextrose at this point, because when I first went against what I was hearing on other podcasts or reading online forums and stuff like that, I thought, I'm going to try it out. I'm going to use it in a double IPA. And this was many years ago, in place of dextrose, just to see for myself, how bad this product can make a beer taste. And it tasted great. There was no influence or no impact that I could perceive. And again, we are our own worst enemies when it comes to breaking down the beers that we brew. At least I am. I'm the one who tends to find most of the flaws in my beers. There was none of that. And so I'd started using it because it's easier to get. It's cheaper than dextrose because you can just go pull it off the grocery store shelf if you're not just stealing what you've got in your pantry. I've done it many times. So that's my anecdote. And then you've got this data that even further substantiates my anecdote and what a lot of other people out there are also saying. And I just want to say, whoever it is that came up with this idea that fermenting table sugar leads to cidery flavors, why? Why did you have to say that? It just blows my mind that became kind of its own meme, and all of these people started to glom onto it because of an appeal to authority is what I can only imagine.
Yeah, and I was, you would assume that it's cheaper, but I didn't realize how much cheaper it is too. Did a little bit of an AI analysis here, and it's saying that, for me locally, it's going to be about 70 cents to $1.50 a pound for table sugar at the grocery store. But dextrose is $4 to $8 a pound.
Yeah.
So it's like
it's way more expensive.
It's almost 10% of the cost. To go table sugar. So, I honestly do continue to stock dextrose in my brewery. And since it's just with my brewing ingredients, it's what I tend to reach for. But man, maybe I should just stop wasting my money and just use table sugar.
Well, and remember, outside of high strength IPA, where even if there was a flavor impact from the sugar, I have a feeling the hops would more than overwhelm it. Most of the beers that I'm making where I'm using sugar are Belgians. Belgians used beet sugar, which is what the cheapest sugar you're going to find at your store is going to be. All of the off-label, like the generic sugars that you get, those are all beet sugar because it's cheaper. They're produced here. They're not produced on an island, hundreds of miles away. Cane sugar is going to be more expensive. I do think that it'd be an interesting experiment. I doubt we're going to see a difference to compare cane sugar to beet sugar, maybe in a seltzer or something, to really see if there's an impact. But based on this, I mean, everything was identical with the exception of what we call the sugar and what the chemical makeup of that sugar is.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it really, flies in the face of the cider argument. And I love getting to do these experiments, and once I have the data, I could be like, hey, remember that IPA that you tried? You couldn't taste the difference. You will never believe the variable. They're like, give it to me again. There's no way. Let's go round two.
You've got those friends, yeah. There is that just weird, like, we want to latch on, and I suppose it's sort of the other side of the coin of confirmation bias, that we look for those things that confirm what we think is good and right and all of that, without really being intentional about it. But on the other side of that is that we are going to kind of defend when we have been duped, or when we feel like we've been duped. And if Brülosophy has taught me anything, it's that, my goodness, people like to talk a lot about shit they don't really know about, or things that they haven't experienced, and that promulgates, that becomes this like a forest fire almost, that everybody just starts to latch onto, and then they get angry when you do something like an experiment that shows that they're wrong. This is one of those few cases where I'm looking and just going, it's so stupid that people for so long have been making these claims, when you've got thousands of people who anecdotally are saying, no, there's no cider flavor from it. And then you've got this data now, and I guarantee you there are people listening wanting to punch their speakers because we're saying this stuff. So if you're one of those people, here's your virtual hug. We're all good. We did get one reader comment I want to get to. This comes from somebody who calls themselves Free Healer. They say, the idea that sucrose imparts a cidery flavor stems from the days when yeast quality was still pretty bad, and racking to a secondary carboy was the widely accepted practice. The cider flavor was acetaldehyde due to poor quality yeast and or oxygen ingress during racking. It did not come from sucrose. Before you respond to this, I just want to say, Free Healer here is speaking with a lot of unequivocalness, and I tend to be way more equivocal. I use words like it may be, it could be. He sounds very convinced, though, or he or she sounds very convinced that the cidery qualities that people spoke of when it came to using sugar was really not because of the sugar, it was because of bad yeast. And I just don't know if that's true or not.
I honestly had the same conspiracy theory myself, though, at the top of the episode when we were thinking about where did this come from. I did wonder if maybe it was acetaldehyde from crappy fermentations. And it reminds me of like some of the crappy homebrews that you've tried that are made of extract. It's like, well, is it the extract, or is it the fact that this is their first time ever doing a fermentation, and they pitched back then we had fewer cell counts, and they're pitching one pack without a starter and fermenting at 75 degrees in a closet in a bucket. It's like, was it really the extract? And so it does make me wonder if it was really the sugar or something else. But again, we don't know for sure, but I think it's an interesting theory.
Yeah, I'm not against the idea that some experiences of a cidery flavor weren't due to the sugar, but because of, bad yeast or bad ingredients in general. My issue with this is the unequivocalness with which this person is saying that. We really don't know. I will say, similar with DMS, I have had acetaldehyde dosed with flavor standard dosed beers, and we're talking like Miller Lite. So you just taste the acetaldehyde. Even at low rates, the flavor that I get from acetaldehyde is more like this kind of grassy. It doesn't taste like cider. At higher doses, it tastes to me almost the way the inside of a pumpkin smells, if that's a descriptor you can understand. It just has this kind of earthy weirdness. It doesn't taste like cider. So I guess the part for me is, where did this idea that cider, just say apples. When I think of cider, I think of apples. Acetaldehyde to me doesn't taste like apples. It tastes more earthy and kind of grassy / pumpkin-y. So again, I don't really know. Free Healer, you may be right. We know that acetaldehyde is a very common off flavor in poorly fermented beers. So it could be that was perceived by somebody as cider, and then that person again promulgated the cider theory out there, and we all started saying that sugar produces cider for those reasons, and we were just wrong. But use sugar. That's my take. Do you have any final words before we wrap this one up, Jordan?
No, not really. I think that what we've learned is that at least in a hoppy format, you can use whatever you have on hand. And if you have the expensive stuff and you want to use it, go for it. But if you want to use the cheap stuff too, it should make a very similar beer.
Yeah, and I'm pro sucrose. I'm pro table sugar. So, you can blame it on me. If you make a bad batch, blame it on me. I'll figure something out. So that does bring us to the end of the episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the Brülosophy Show over at YouTube. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middle.